Temple Small Business Development Center. The Temple SBDC helps small businesses start, grow, and succeed. We do this through our no-cost consulting and a variety of our no-cost webinars and training programs like the one you're attending today. You're joining us for Franchising Best Practices Part 1. We are recording today's session, and a copy of the recording and PowerPoint will be sent to all attendees within a few business days. All attendees are muted. We encourage you to post any questions that you may have in the Q&A and chat box. Now I'll turn over the floor to Tony Lowe.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending today's Franchise Best Practices series. This is part 1. We'll be doing part 2 in about a month. And first and foremost, I just want to say, we always appreciate the opportunity at Lopes Law, at my law firm, to work with Temple SBDC, but this is not a replacement for good legal advice, nor is it a replacement for meeting with an actual franchise attorney. So if you need help with your franchise, we do free initial consultations at Lopes Law. Give us a call, contact me. You can get my information through the SBDC, and we can definitely connect with you and hopefully help you through whether it's the beginning of your franchise journey or the end of your franchise journey. We can help you to overcome any challenges that you're facing in your franchise business. Okay, so first and foremost, what are we going to cover today? So today we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of good, solid review of your franchise documents before you get involved in a franchise. We're going to talk a lot about how to learn to protect yourself when evaluating franchise agreements and disclosure documents so that you can avoid getting yourself into a bad situation. And we're looking to help you have a clear sense of what to look for in franchise agreements and in FDDs and federal franchise disclosure documents so that you can understand how to navigate potential pitfalls and avoid those pitfalls in your franchise life cycle and hopefully put yourself on the path to franchise success. This session will cover the key legal documents, red flags, and essential clauses in those franchise agreements. But again, I cannot reiterate enough that this does not replace good legal counsel. This session is for informational purposes only. So if you need help, make sure you contact an actual franchise attorney. So let's talk about, first and foremost, the franchise disclosure document. It's the FDD, which you may, if you've ever contacted a franchisor, have already heard about. Or if you're working with a franchise broker, you may have talked to someone about this a little bit. So what is it? It's a legal document that's required by the Federal Trade Commission to inform franchisees or prospective franchisees of the essential details about a particular franchise offering. The FDD itself consists of 23 items. When I say 23 items, I mean 23 major sections. It's broken down into 23 major sections. And those things include financial performance, what your obligations as a franchisee are going to be, the potential range of fees that you're likely to pay as a franchisee of whatever system you're considering, and the potential risks. Now, realistically, you'll also see some things about your total investment, again, a range, things covering territorial rights, and your operational obligations. And you want to make sure that you really pay attention to all of those details when you're reviewing the FDD so that you understand, what is this business that I'm getting myself into? What is the potential sort of max and min of the investment that I'm going to have to put out to be a part of this franchise system, and how much am I putting at risk? And then what are my actual obligations? Now, all of the things in the FDD that I just talked about will also appear, or should also appear, in the franchise agreement itself. The franchise agreement is usually an attachment or an exhibit to that FDD. And a legal counsel like myself, a franchise attorney, will help you to review that franchise agreement to make sure that you understand all of the risks and obligations that you're legally bound to. But those things should also match. So if there's something in the FDD or something in the franchise agreement that isn't in the opposite document, that's usually a red flag in and of itself. If anything, it shows that the franchisor is maybe disorganized or not paying attention to detail, and you're starting off on the wrong foot, okay? So there's also some recent legal cases that cover lawsuits over misrepresentations found in the FDD. Unfortunately, we've seen an uptick in misrepresentations from franchisors to prospective franchisees. But I just want to talk about for a second how practically you don't want to get yourself into a situation where you have to sue the franchisor. Typically, if the franchise isn't working out, cash flow is going to be an issue, and you're going to be starting off on the wrong foot and from a position of disadvantage against a franchisor that probably has a little bit more capital than you do to invest in a franchise attorney. So you want to try to avoid lawsuits as much as possible and make sure that you're doing all of your due diligence up front so that you know whether or not what the franchisor is telling you is in fact true or likely to be accurate. Okay. When we're talking about key sections of the FDD, so you should absolutely review your own FDD one way or the other, but your attorney, you should have a franchise attorney to review the franchise agreement with you, since that's a legally binding document. But a good franchise attorney will also go through the major sections of the FDD with you to make sure that you understand what exactly is said in them and what exactly you're getting yourself into. First and foremost, you want to look at item 19. Now, all 23 items are important, but item 19 talks about the earnings claims of the franchisor or the financial projections, or sometimes both. You want to ensure that item 19 is based on solid evidence and industry benchmarks. So you want to do your own research in addition to what you're reading in item 19 to make sure that those numbers seem to sync up with industry benchmarks for whatever industry you're considering for the franchise. Additionally, you want to look through the FDD and make sure that you understand, again, the fees and the initial investment. And you're going to see a range, most likely, in most FDDs when it comes to your initial investment and when it comes to the sort of table of fees that you're expected to pay. But you want to make sure that you understand all of those fees. And I would say that a good rule of thumb is making sure that you're comfortable with paying the maximum of those fees, because you could potentially be at risk to do so. The fees should also list any royalties that you're going to be paying, any advertising fees that you'll be paying, and any operating costs that you'll have throughout not only the launch of the franchise, but throughout the life cycle of the franchise. Misunderstanding these fees or your initial investment can lead to significant financial strain because you can get yourself in over your head, right? And I understand that you're very excited about the initial franchise opportunity, but you want to make sure that you review the FDD to confirm that all of the numbers from the franchisor sync up to what you're expecting. We'll also talk a little bit later in this webinar about franchise validation, which is an important step that you should also take while you're reviewing your FDD. The other thing you want to look at is your franchisee obligations. Make sure that you understand your operational obligations, any training that you're going to have to undergo, what your marketing obligations are, not just your investment, your financial investment into the marketing obligations, but what are the things that you will actually need to do yourself from a marketing perspective. Look at also the supply chain responsibilities. Do you have to buy all of your supplies for your franchise business from a specific supplier? And is that supplier an affiliate of the franchisor? You want to make sure that you understand what your obligations are when it comes to the franchise system. Typically, those things are also going to be heavily detailed in the franchise agreement, because the franchisor is going to want you legally bound to the terms of the franchise system. So you got to make sure that you understand not only what you're paying, but what you're responsible for in terms of operations, from marketing to supply chain management and everything in between. In the actual franchise agreement, you want to make sure that you understand the long-term impact. Most franchise agreements are 10 years long. So if you're getting yourself into a 10-year relationship with the franchisor, you want to make sure that you've got all of the risks and obligations laid out in a way that makes sense to you and that you're comfortable with. So first and foremost, you want to look at any renewal or termination rights, right? Do you have the right to renew? If so, what are all the hurdles that you have to jump and loops that you have to go through to be able to earn the right to renew? And if so, when does that trigger, and when do you need to notify the franchisor of your interest in renewing the franchise agreement? Additionally, and I can't emphasize this enough, you want to understand the termination rights of the agreement itself, because 9 times out of 10, when franchisees are in a bad situation, they come to us at Lopes Law and they tell us that they haven't spoken to an attorney before, they didn't have a franchise attorney review their agreement, and now they don't know what their termination rights are or if they can even terminate. The answer typically is yes, there's some path to termination, but you want to know what your specific scenario is from the beginning so that if things go in the wrong direction, you know exactly what you have to do to start working towards getting out of a bad situation. Additionally, when it comes to your territory rights, you want to check whether or not you have exclusive rights or if the franchisor can open up competing units nearby. Believe it or not, a lot of franchise systems give you semi-exclusive rights to a territory where you may be the only franchisee that can operate within a certain radius, but the franchisor can actually come in and compete with you even within your own territory. Okay, so make sure you understand exactly what's going on in the agreement and what rights you do or do not have before you execute that agreement, okay? Additionally, you want to look at the non-compete clauses. There's going to be a lot of restrictions on franchisees. People are mistakenly under the impression that non-competes are going to restrict the ability, the new non-compete laws are going to restrict the ability of franchisors from having franchisees sign these non-compete clauses and have them be enforceable. Our current position is that you should sign it as if they are enforceable, because more likely than not, in a court of law, a franchisor is going to be able to currently impose a non-compete against a franchisee. So you want to understand the restrictions on your activities during and after the agreement, especially if you have to leave the franchise or if you have to leave the franchise early because things aren't working out. Okay. The other thing I want to make you hyper aware of, and it's not on these slides, is that you will more likely than not have to sign a personal guarantee in order to be able to be a part of a franchise system. What that means is if you open up any LLC or separate entity for your franchise business, you're still going to be personally liable to the franchisor for any and all liabilities, risks, obligations that are in the franchise agreement. That may or may not be something that you're willing to accept, but I also want you to be aware of the fact that nowadays we're seeing spousal guarantees added on top of the personal guarantee in the franchise agreement. What a spousal guarantee is it's an additional agreement that you're signing that says, not only am I going to be personally liable, but my spouse is also agreeing to be personally liable, and the marital assets that we have as a married couple are also going to be on the table for the franchisor to collect against if you get sued by the franchisor for breach of contract or anything like that. So you want to make sure that you're aware of these things, talking to a good attorney that can help you to negotiate these provisions if you're not comfortable with them, and make sure that you understand everything that you're signing before you sign it. The question of whether or not a franchise agreement is negotiable is one that you may hear, oh, franchise agreements aren't negotiable. Don't bother asking your attorney to negotiate because we don't negotiate with franchisees when it comes to our franchise agreements. That is not 100% accurate. I would say that most of the time we can negotiate some clauses in favor of our franchisee clients when we're working with them in negotiations with a franchisor. So again, a good franchise attorney that understands franchise law, that understands the dynamics between a franchisor and a franchisee when negotiating a franchise agreement can be well worth what they charge in legal fees so that you can get a better situation set up for yourself and maybe avoid having to sign some of these things that might not make you as comfortable. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about red flags in franchise offers. So I've seen a lot of good franchises, I've seen a lot of bad franchises, and from my experience as a franchise attorney, a lot of times the writing was on the wall, you just had to look for it, right? So first of all, if you're seeing overly optimistic earnings claims and you're not seeing a reasonably conservative franchisor, you should probably beware of unrealistic financial promises not being backed by detailed documentation. If they're making big claims, ask them to see how and why they came up with those numbers. Because typically, I've seen more successful franchisors that were optimistically conservative with their franchisees and making sure that the franchisee cared more about the system and being a part of the mission of the franchisor than big numbers. Typically, if they're throwing lots of big numbers at you and they're, of course, want you to be excited, but they're sort of overselling the franchise opportunity, it's something that you should be very cautious about. Also, if they're not being detailed about what their operational support is going to be like, that's not a good early sign. Franchisors that do not clearly define their support for franchisees may leave you isolated with your hands in the air going, the franchisor never trained me, or the franchisor never offered me the support that they said they were going to do. They never met their commitments. And that's just going to continue to exacerbate throughout the franchise life cycle. So you want to make sure that you understand what they're going to offer you in terms of operational support. And again, we'll talk in a little bit about franchise validation and how you can do some of these things and unearth some of these things, aside from making sure that you thoroughly review the FDD and franchise agreement with your franchise attorney. But you want to make sure that you are understanding what operational support they're going to offer you, okay? And then if a franchisor is asking you for very high initial fees without any guarantees to back up that sort of quid pro quo, that exchange, then you should be clear that those large upfront payments are going to come with minimal returns or support that can signal, again, a problematic franchise. So good franchisors, you know, the more successful systems out there, we all know the brands, they are successful for a reason, right? They're proven in multiple markets, they're proven in times of economic downturn. If you're seeing a smaller franchisor or franchisor that's, you know, in the middle of a launch or trying to scale their operations, you need to be very, very cautious about what you're being offered and make sure that you understand exactly what they're saying that you're going to get and that they can actually meet those burdens, okay? If that operational assistance isn't clearly spelled out, you may find yourself struggling without any needed help. So if you're left in a business where you've invested, you know, tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in it in the first few years, and you're left without any support, you may struggle to meet the bottom line that you have to, your minimum royalties and your minimum payments to the franchisor, and be left with no support and no recourse, okay? So you want to make sure that you're very cautious about that. When it comes to, and as I promised, when it comes to validating a franchise concept, here are some tips that I've found and that I've provided clients with over the years. First and foremost, you want to talk to existing franchisees. Validation calls, so literally getting on the phone and calling up existing franchisees, is the number one way to unearth whether or not this is a good franchise concept, okay? You want to call as many franchisees as you possibly can. You want to call franchisees in your surrounding territories if there are some, and if not, call franchisees in other territories or other states, but that are in similar markets, right? So if you're in the Philadelphia market, you want to look for franchisees that are in cities and states that have a similar market dynamic, similar population size, similar demographics, similar service lines or product lines, and understand how the franchise is performing in those similar markets, okay? That is the number one way to determine whether or not a franchise is going to be good or bad for you, and also whether or not it's going to be a good fit. At our firm, we typically provide our clients with a 20-question list that they can use as a prospective script to go and call their validation, to make their validation calls, and to understand what exactly they're getting when they're getting into a new franchise, okay? You want to also visit as many franchise locations in person as you possibly can. And even if it's a system that doesn't have brick and mortar locations, agree to meet with the mobile units, agree to meet with anyone even at their office, or meet with the franchisee face to face for coffee, so that you can get a feel for what a day is like in the franchise. And don't just do it with the franchisor present. By the way, make sure that you're going on these validation trips to visit franchise locations without the franchisor present, and even maybe without necessarily giving the franchisor a heads up. You can just call the franchisee and say, hey, do you mind if I stop by and kind of shadow you for an hour, or hang out with you for a day, and see what it's like to be a part of this franchise system. The other thing you want to do is very carefully review the financial performance of the franchise, right? And again, this goes back to item 19. This goes back to just doing your strong due diligence, and that is carefully analyze all available financial data that you can unearth about this franchisor, including average revenue, profit margins, ROI, and comparing these figures again with industry benchmarks to determine whether or not these are accurate and whether or not the franchise can meet your financial goals. Most of the time, we see franchisees who are disgruntled because the financial output of the franchise didn't meet what they were expecting. Okay. So just recap, and then we'll get into some questions to see if we can help any of you overcoming current challenges in your franchise lifecycle. So ensure thorough review of that FDD. I want you to understand as many of the key clauses as you can. A good franchise attorney is going to sit down with you and go over the clauses in the agreement together and make sure that you understand exactly, in plain English, what's in that franchise agreement. If you're talking to a franchise attorney that's just giving you a very general analysis and isn't giving you a thorough review, you've probably picked the wrong attorney. Okay. You can always contact attorneys and get multiple quotes from them and get an idea of how they operate with their franchisees, how they help their franchisees through their franchise journey, and get a good feel for whether or not the franchise attorney is going to be a good fit for you. Okay. All right. Let's take some questions if we have any questions.
At the moment, we don't have any questions.
Okay. Well, it's kind of an open floor now from this point till the end of the webinar. If we don't have any questions, we can end the webinar early, certainly, but I want to make sure that everyone here has the opportunity to ask any questions if they have them. Franchise is a great way, franchising in general is a great way to get into business for yourself if you're thinking about becoming your own boss, but it can be perilous if you don't have a good franchise attorney on your side. So again, you want to make sure that you're working with a team of professionals that understand the industry and have your best interest at heart when they're representing you. So just be careful out there while you're reviewing the FDD and the franchise agreement.
I have a question.
Please.
Yeah, so you mentioned about shadowing. So
Yes.
what is like a good amount of time that a person should shadow before like putting their investment in the franchise?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, it's whatever your comfort level is to make sure that you understand the business. I would go out and try to shadow at least 3 franchisees if possible, if that's feasible for you, if they're close enough to you, and if you can go and sort of spend the day with them. The second best thing, or the next best thing, if you can't physically, shadow someone in person, is to sit with them on a Google Meet or a Zoom for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 60 minutes, whatever amount of time they'll give you, or to meet with them in person for a cup of coffee, tea, whatever. So that you can get a feel for what business is like. Okay. And then certainly last but not least, if you can't shadow anybody, or you don't have enough time, or you don't feel comfortable, those validation calls are a critical minimum step, I would say.
I believe that concludes all of the questions for the webinar.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for joining. It's been a pleasure. These slides will be available for you to have. Join us next month for sure, where we'll get into more specific detail about these things. We'll start to dig into some of these items. I'll show you, kind of some examples of the areas that you need to look into when you're analyzing an FDD and a franchise agreement.
All right, thank you everyone for joining. We will have part 2 coming up. You can find the registration link on our website, or you can email us directly at sbdc@temple to register for the webinar. There was a survey that is posted in the chat box. We do value your feedback, as well as it's required by our funders. That way we can continue to present no-cost webinars like today. If you can complete that 4-question survey, we will greatly appreciate it, as well as forward any questions that you may have post-webinar. A follow-up email will be sent with the presentation as well as the recording. Again, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Tony, for presenting. Have a great day. Bye.